This is the Business Storytelling Show, a top global marketing podcast listened to in more than 100 countries, live streamed on social media, and Christoph Trapp chats with industry leaders to help your company tell better business stories. Here's today's episode.
Episode 707. Thanks everyone for joining me. Christoph Trapp, your host of the Business Storytelling Podcast. We're going to be talking about, can you say things that can't be unheard? And this is a very interesting book by Tamsen Webster. She was on the show, I don't know how many episodes ago. It's been a while. And of course, since we're talking to another accomplished author, we are live on Amazon. And everything you see around me, you can buy in my storefront. So if you're not, I point out, but the thing could be anywhere. Depends what device you're on. Oh my God, I know technology, my friends. But everything you can see around me is on Amazon. Christoph Trapp on Amazon if you want to search for me. The other thing I want to show you really quickly, flipping to camera number 2, all this stuff over here, if you're on the Christmas spirit, you can get on Amazon. I don't know why that's blurry, so we're going to have to figure that out the next time we do a camera switch in the middle of the show. But let's get to today's topic. Say what they can't unhear. How do you do that? How do you stand out? How do you make sure people can understand your message and, can't unhear it and remember it and share it? Tamsen, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much, Christoph.
So good to have you back on the show. Now, it's very interesting. Everybody wants to stand out, but it's so difficult for people because, I don't know, people just like say the same old gobbledygook like everybody else. And then, I might not be able to unhear it, but it's not going to stick with me. So tell me about the new book.
Well, the new book is in one way, it probably looks like a bit of a switch for some people, but for me, it's always been the same thing. So this is not a marketing book. This is absolutely a strategic communications book, leadership, persuasion, influence. And while these principles do apply to marketing and differentiation, fundamentally, it's about what is it that you need to say, not just so that it's remarkable, but so that it gets remembered and remembered enough that people decide to act on it.
Yeah, it sounds so simple in theory, but it is hard for people to get people to listen. I'll give you an example. I'm interviewing people for, different roles here and there. And my philosophy is, let me just give you a quick overview of the role from my perspective. I know you read the thing probably, but it drives me crazy when, like in the old days when I interviewed for jobs and they would quiz me on their job description, which probably wasn't even accurate anyways, because it ran through 12 people.
Yeah.
And so I give them an overview and I always say who my audience is for whatever the role is. And there's a lot of times when people say, oh, and what industry do you specialize in? And I'm like, I literally just said that. Like, how could you not hear it? So you tell me, what can I do better in instances where I want people to hear it, but for some reason they don't? Is it the delivery? Is it too all over the place? What happened?
No, I think that ultimately it comes down to like, how do our brains work and how does our attention work? And if you think about it from the perspective that we will pay attention to the things that we are interested in paying attention to, that is both the problem and the solution. Meaning, if we're trying to get somebody's attention with something that they don't know to pay attention to, or that they have no reason to be interested, or they don't immediately see the relevance, they're not going to. There's just way too much information coming at people. And so one of the underlying principles that's in this book is this idea that even though there are things that maybe they're not interested in, where you or your offerings or services might be concerned, there are plenty of things that they are currently interested in. So the answer really lies in, how can you attach the thing that you do, or your product, your service, your book, your idea, to something that somebody already wants. And it's not that it's about bait and switch. This does need to be something that you actively want, but I will briefly step on this soapbox and then step right back off again. And so often we focus on what we think somebody else's problem is, what we think the real problem is. But if they don't understand that they have that real problem, they'll never find you, right? And they'll never find that peace. So I've just found over and over again, it says it's about really starting and anchoring with something that you're fairly sure that the person you're talking to is actively and knowingly interested in.
And how important is it to talk a certain way or to, um, you know, be succinct, I guess? So, for example, the feedback I've received from my communications coach on these podcast episodes is sometimes you have a great soundbite. Here's a soundbite, and boom, we can use that. And sometimes, very focused. And then sometimes I start with, and I think I did this earlier. I started with one thought, and I go do like 5 other thoughts, and we try to circle back,
Yeah.
and nobody remembers what we were just talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple things in play there. One is that is delivery important? Generally, yes, but fundamentally, my experience has been that content will trump how something is delivered every time. So if somebody is interested enough in what you're saying, and if they, as they're listening to what you're saying, find it valuable enough, then you don't need to be perfectly polished, perfectly concise, etc. That said, when you're first talking to people, when you're first trying to get their attention, you have a tiny, tiny window to really make it clear why they should keep listening. And oftentimes, when we really can't find the words, or we kind of do like word salad, or we kind of vomit words all over the page or over the other person, uh, this is where I'll quote one of my favorite authors, since we're also on Amazon right now, Agatha Christie, who said that words are only the outer clothing of ideas. So oftentimes, if we can't really find the right words, it's because we're not entirely clear on what it is that we're trying to say first. And so part of what I'm trying to do with this book is really help people understand that what is like the minimum viable conversation that we need to have. What's the minimum viable information that people need to hear in order to be interested, in order to understand what you're saying, and to have enough understanding and interest to decide whether or not they agree. Because those three elements, interest, understanding, agreement, are absolute requirements before somebody will act. And it's certainly required before they will change.
I mean, it's so interesting. And even when you were talking, I was thinking about the chapter on, when two truths, it was like when two truths fight,
Right? Only one wins.
right?
Yep.
And so what I'm thinking about here is, so I think I said this a number of times in the last couple of weeks. I said, here's the one thing and here's the other thing. And even though they seem to be kind of opposites, they both can exist in it together. Like they can both be true, not to go into politics.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right? But
Yes.
anyway, but talk about that. So why that chapter?
Why did I spend a whole chapter on it? Okay. So a couple of things. One is, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Again, let's go for authors since we're on Amazon. F. Scott Fitzgerald famously said that it's a mark of intelligence, to be able to hold two competing truths in our mind at the same time. And we humans do this constantly. I was recently introduced to the work of a really impressive thinker, author, speaker named Tim Arnold. And he has a book called Lead with And he talks about these ever-present tensions in our lives. And he calls them crux tensions. Things like, the kind of that tension between kind of meeting expectations and extending grace, that, for instance. So there are these tensions that are always the case, except, and we can generally function with them as, being able to swap in, swap out what is important in a given moment. And that's because as humans, our values are actually relational. We'd like to think that we behave the same way and we apply the same rules the same way every time, but we don't. It's actually quite contextual. So it's that context piece that's important, because when it comes to driving action and really driving change, which is what this book is about, sustained action. How do you create that internally motivated action? There is this magical thing that happens if you bring these two things that normally would be opposed together in a moment, somebody will choose, particularly if something that they want is on the line. So again, this is one of those reasons why it's so important when you're thinking about a change or a message to anchor it in something that your audience actively and knowingly wants right now, because the more that they want that thing, the more difficult it will be to unwant it. And when you present the change that you are offering, inviting them to make as a kind of impossible tension with what they're currently doing, then almost always they will choose something else that will still allow them to get what they want. And so that whole chapter is really about, we have to make that conflict felt, not in a painful way that would violate another chapter, but we have to actually bring these two things to a head. So in that moment, someone has that opportunity and the agency and the sense of control to make a choice based on what they value most. And again, if it works in your favor, fabulous. That's the whole point, to try to figure out how to make it most likely to work in your favor. But sometimes it won't. And that brings in the next to last chapter, whereas you can't want it more than they do.
You know, what's interesting to me as I'm listening to you talk about it. So when somebody were to say to me, there's two truths, only one wins, like without any other context, I'm thinking is, oh, one of them is no longer a truth, right? Because it just didn't win. But really, when I hear you talk about it now, I'm thinking it's not about what's true and what's not true. It's more about, I mean, it's like there's two things happening, right? So like,
Oh, yeah.
let's say I want to, live streaming is a good strategy. And so is podcasting, right? And audio podcasting still is.
Yep.
And so they're both true, but I can't focus on everything. Maybe that's not the best example.
Yeah.
I have to pick one to focus on, right? So if somebody comes to me and there's two truths. One is I want to be secure in my job, and the other one is, oh, there's another new change manager coming in, and they're going to just blow things up, and they're going to leave in 6 months. Which of those truths are going to win, right?
Yes,
The one
right.
that's most beneficial to me.
Well, and what the book is really about is about anchoring essentially your case for a change in deep truths that your audience intuitively or already agrees with. And the example I use in the book, maybe this will be helpful, is a very famous example, and that is the De Beers diamond tagline, "A diamond is forever." So let's reconstruct this with what we've already talked about so far. So if we want to anchor the message in something that our ideal customer, client, audience actively and knowingly wants. So you could say that back in 1947, when that tagline was first introduced, a way to frame that thing that somebody actively and knowingly wanted, it wasn't a diamond ring, by the way. It was something like the best symbol of this forever commitment they were like, these two people were about to make to each other, right? They're asking, the question they're actively and knowingly asking is like, how can I find the best symbol, like, to really mark our marriage, our commitment? Now, the issue is that up until 1947, generally people were focused on the ring, the unbroken circle of metal, a circle with no beginning and no end. By the way, a perfectly good symbol of forever. But they were focused more on that part of the ring than any other part of the ring. And so, in other words, the ring is a symbol, but the kind of ring could be a symbol too. Now, that is also a truth. But when De Beers introduced this statement that a diamond is forever, also a truth. Notice they didn't say a diamond ring is forever, because that people could argue with, but a diamond is forever. Most people, for all intents and purposes, would agree that a diamond is a very difficult thing to destroy. It's a very good symbol for forever, in other words. So what that did was it created a tension between actually multiple truths. Do I really want the best symbol? If I want the best symbol, is the ring the best symbol, which was the previous truth? And it doesn't mean that it's, again, not true. It's just that there's something now in that context that's more true, which is if I can take the symbol of the ring, a great symbol, and add another symbol of forever to it, now I've like doubled down on the forever commitment, because I believe a diamond is forever as well. So in that context, what it did was it shifted people. It's so again, it didn't disprove that the unbroken circle is a symbol. It just allowed them to integrate another truth into how they were looking at it. But it meant that they actually started to look in a different direction. It changed how they thought about rings going forward.
Just so interesting, the nuances of communication and how people make decisions, and everybody kind of does it subconsciously, right? But you have to, as a communicator, you have to think about it a little bit more. So, to make it work. Now, the next chapter you were talking about, you can't want it more than they do, which is very interesting because some of these change initiatives as the leader or even a business owner. I was just thinking about a company the other day, and they create this like very, very niche widget, for lack of a better term.
Mm.
And I'm like, they have to be so passionate about that little widget. I don't care how much money they make, but at some point you have to care about it somehow because that's all you're going to be talking about. Do you know what I mean? So like,
Well,
where's
I'm not
that
saying
line?
that you don't care about it, but the thing is
Yeah.
that to again cite the example I use in the book. If you've ever tried to cancel your cable service, like that's a great example of when like the cable company almost always wants you as a customer more than you do, right? Because and what they fail to understand sometimes is like, I understand all the things that you're offering me with your product or your service. I just don't want it. And so this comes back to really, Christoph, to what we were saying in the beginning, which is you have to find a legitimate reason for somebody that they already agree is true about why they would want something. So just as an example, one of the ways to figure this out is to essentially think about, where are you anchoring your product or service on either a personal or a business hierarchy of needs. I talk about the business hierarchy of needs in my first book, Find Your Red Thread. But for instance, I was working with a friend and a client, and she was originally anchoring her message, which was about energy management, along the lines of how can I be my best self in high stakes moments? Now that's important. Absolutely. People want that. And my friend is deeply passionate about her topic and her solution of how to approach energy management. But if you think about it, how to be your best self is very much at the top of that pyramid. It's a self-actualization kind of thing. But if you're familiar with Maslow's pyramid, and maybe even if you're not, there's a bunch of other needs that are we're going to find to be more urgent or more important if they're sitting there unmet. Meaning there are issues of belonging and love and connection and safety and physiological. And so what we did when we were working together is that we dropped the urgency and the importance of that to its most critical level that we could legitimately do it. And so we switched the question from how can I be my best self in high stakes moments to how can I get the level of mental energy that I want? Do you see and do you feel how that's a physiological question? Because it's one of those things like, if I don't have the mental energy, then I'm not going to get anything else. I'm not going to be able to do a good job, which means I'm not going to get my salary, which means if I don't have the mental energy, I'm not going to be able to interact with people, which means I'm not going to get that belonging. And yes, eventually it means that I can't be my best self. But there's all these other things that are much more urgently important before that. So you're absolutely right. If somebody's got a very niche product, they have to love what they're doing, because I think any of us have to love what it is that we're doing, or else you're right. We're not going to have the mental energy, to quote my client, to get out there and do it. And our products, our services, our ideas, our books, they are not for everyone. They are for people who have the question, actively and knowingly have the question that our product, service, idea, approach answers. And they also share the beliefs about why our particular approach would work to provide that answer. So it isn't just, hey, this is a valuable thing. They have to understand why it's valuable, and they have to agree with you on that. And that touches on a couple different of the chapters, but fundamentally, that's what it comes down to. And keeping that in your mind will help avoid one of the most dangerous problems that I see when I work with startups, and particularly B2C startups that have a physical product. Making sure that you're always thinking about what question does this actively, what question that our audience is actively knowingly asking right now, what question does that answer, will help keep you from developing a solution in search of a problem. Because one of the most difficult things to do from a motivation standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, from a communication standpoint, is to get somebody to want something that they do not actively and knowingly want. It is incredibly inefficient and therefore incredibly expensive approach. And yet, if you think about it, a huge amount of marketing, sales, and leadership messaging is about trying to convince people that they want something that they don't currently want, or just as hard to convince them they don't want something that they think they do.
One of the things I heard embedded there a little bit is you have to kind of find the right people,
Yeah,
on the team.
100%. Yeah, your people are your people. Like that's it. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
And
it's like,
and I'm of the opinion that if you're clear on that and succinct about that, back to one of your earlier questions, they will find you because you are specific enough, you're clear enough, you're talking in language and in concepts and in implicit beliefs and values, and sometimes explicit beliefs and values that they agree with, so that when they see that, instead of just saying, hey, I'm a marketing consultant, that's one thing. Maybe you need a marketing consultant, but if you're really struggling with kind of email adoption, wouldn't you be much more likely to focus on somebody who is very clearly about answering the question about how to make your email work for you, right? Or instead of just a generic copywriter, for instance, wouldn't you prefer to work with somebody who says, I only write sales nurturing emails? Like that's the thing that they do. So, I mean, and maybe you want a generalist. In that case, it's different, but it really is thinking about who are you for? And, I've been in marketing and branding and message design for 25 years, Christoph. And I think a lot of times we miss the mark because we're trying to think in terms of segments or psychographics or demographics. And yet what I've seen over and over again is that fundamentally what actually is the best indicator of who your audience is what question they're asking. And that really, if we can just really keep our things focused to that, we end up making clearer messages, stronger messages, much more motivating messages. And we also see all the benefits that clearer, stronger, more motivating messages can lead to.
So to everyone that has hired me previously, many, many years ago, to come in and change something in their company with content, but I wasn't allowed to hire a team or I wasn't allowed to fire anyone, it was not my fault. It was your fault because they didn't want to change. And guess what? They're not going to. And now we know it in Say What They Can't Unhear. It's a great read by Tamsen Webster. Tamsen, it was great to see you back on the show.
Great to see you.
Tell us again, how do people connect with you? Who should reach out? Who do you work with?
Well, I work with I work with anyone who has that question of how to build buy-in, lasting buy-in for change. That can be large scale change, small scale change. But if you're somebody who's really working on trying to figure out how to solve that problem for yourself, then reach out. You can find all the ways to apply what you read about and Say What They Can't Unhear at the messagedesigninstitute.com. That's messagedesigninstitute.com. And if you're interested in working with me specifically or having me come into your organization, then that's at tamsenwebster.com.
Fantastic. Nice to see you. And we're out.
Thanks for tuning in. Please rate and review the Business Storytelling Show on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. See you then.